Just as we have a life cycle for the component creation, we also have one for updating components. So when props or state change, which are the two triggers you have for a component to be re-evaluated by React, then we go through a different life cycle. This life cycle then starts with get-derived state from props being called. A lifecycle method which you'll not use too often. You would use it to initialize the state of a component that updates based on props you're getting, so updated props you're getting most likely. And it could be, for example, some form control which gets external properties, and then you internally want to handle user input but initialize your state or update your state based on outside changes. And as you will see throughout this course, we'll not use that lifecycle hook because actually you very rarely need that, and often there is a more elegant way of updating your state or of managing your components based on external properties. Nonetheless, this hook exists. It's there for you to sync your local state inside of the component to your props you're getting. You should not cause side effects in here, so don't send any HTTP requests or anything like that. Thereafter, we reach should component update, and that is a very interesting hook indeed, which I'll dive deeper into in the next lectures. This method, and by the way, I use the term lifecycle methods and lifecycle hooks interchangeably. So this lifecycle method or hook here is interesting because it allows you to cancel the updating process. So here you can decide whether or not React should continue evaluating and re-rendering the component. Now, why would you do that? For performance optimization, as you will learn over the next lectures. This should be used carefully because obviously you can break your components if you block an update from happening incorrectly, but it is very powerful since it allows you to also prevent unnecessary update cycles. Now after that, the render method is called, and React then goes through the JSX code, evaluates that, and basically constructs its virtual DOM, into which I'll also dive later in this module, for you and sees if it needs to update the real DOM. Now there, as always, you prepare and structure your JSX code therefore. Now, React then goes ahead and updates all child components of this component. So it evaluates all the child components you have in your JSX code of this main component we're looking at here, for which this lifecycle here runs. And of course, every child component then also goes through that lifecycle if it receives new props or state. Now after that, we reach get snapshot before update. This is a lifecycle hook that takes the previous props and the previous state as input, and that actually returns a snapshot object which you can freely configure. And this also is a niche lifecycle hook which we'll not use too much. You use it for last-minute DOM operations, but with that I don't really mean changes to the DOM, but things like getting the current scrolling position of the user. So imagine that your upcoming update of your component will re-render the DOM and will add new elements on the DOM, and you therefore want to restore the scrolling position of the user once the update is done. Well, then get snapshot before update can give you that, well, snapshot of the user state, so of the scrolling position, right before the update happens, and then you can consume and use that snapshot once the update is done to scroll the user back to where he was or anything like that. And last but not least, once we're done with the update, component did update is called. A lifecycle hook that signals that you're now done with the updating, that the render method has been executed, and here you can now cause side effects. So here you could now make an HTTP request, though you'll have to watch out to not enter an infinite loop here. If you make an HTTP request and you get back a response and you then update your component and then this cycle starts again. And that is also something we'll have a look at later in this course once we dive into HTTP requests, because there this is a typical problem you'll be facing. Now what you shouldn't do here outside of the, let's say, then block of a promise of an HTTP request is updating the state with setState. It's fine to do it as a result of some async task you're kicking off here, but you should not call it synchronously in component did update, because that will simply lead to an unnecessary re-render cycle. So let's now have a look at all these lifecycle methods in practice, and let's start with the scenario that our props changed. To see these update lifecycle hooks in practice, I will convert persons and person component to class-based components so that we can throw some lifecycle hooks into these as well. Now let's start with the person.js file. Converting a component to a class-based component is very simple. You simply import component from React because we'll need to extend that. And then instead of returning a function or having a function that you store in a variable or constant here, you create a new class, which you typically name with a capital starting character like person, that extends component. And then you have opening and closing curly braces, but in there, you now need a render method, which actually returns your JSX code. So in there, you can then move in this console log, and there you should now add this return statement where you return the JSX code. And that is almost it, but props doesn't exist anymore. Instead, all these places where you have props now should become this props, because as you learned, in class-based components, props are accessed with the this keyword, since they are properties of this class. So let's add a this in front of all these props. And here we go. That is the converted person component. Last thing we need to change is the export. There I am exporting person with a lowercase p because my constant was named such. Now the class has an uppercase p, so here I should update person like that. And this is now the converted person component. Now definitely feel free to now convert the percents component on your own. And after the short pause, which you can use to pause the video, we'll do it together. So were you successful? Let's convert the persons component. And just as before, first of all, I will import component from React. And then here, this is converted to a class named persons, which extends component, opening and closing curly braces. In there, a render method. And in that render method, we can throw in our return statement where we return JSX code, like this. Now again, props doesn't exist, so this becomes this props here. And then we export persons with a capital P. And that is it. That is the adjusted percents component. And of course, the app works just as before, like this. And you see I also get a warning regarding component will mount, by the way. But we can ignore that. As I mentioned, this will be removed eventually, but in older versions of React, you can still use it. Here, the focus is on our conversion of the class-based component or of the functional components to class-based components, which work just fine. So let's now see these updating lifecycle hooks in action. I'll start here in my persons.js component, and I'll start with the static get derived state from props lifecycle hook again, which gets props and state. Should return a state, and here I'll return the unchanged state, and I don't even have a state here, so this will just be an empty object. And I want to console log persons.js get derived state from props, like this. Thereafter, should component update will run, and should component update gets the next props, so the upcoming props, which will have an effect right after this update, which is about to take place, and the upcoming state as arguments. And in here, now you actually have to return true or false. Doing nothing is not an option. You have to return true if React should continue updating, or false if it shouldn't. And of course, you don't typically hard code that in here, but instead you add some condition where you compare the current props to your next props, to the upcoming props, to find out if they changed, and if they changed, you want to permit this. For now, I will just return true here, though, and I'll dive a bit deeper into this in a dedicated lecture in this module. So let me console log persons.js should component update. After should component update, we have get snapshot before update, and there we get our previous props and we get our previous state. And I will console log persons.js get snapshot before update here. Render will execute, and I already have a log in here. Then the render cycle or the update cycle of all child components of this component will execute, so of all the person components in this case. And thereafter, we'll have component did update. And component did update will run once we're done with all the updating. So here I will console log persons.js component did update, like this. Let's have a look at that, and to get rid of that error regarding component will mount, I'll comment this out. Only older versions of React will support this. And what we see is now our default rendering cycle for creating the component. If I click toggle persons, you see what happens is get derived state from props runs again, then render. And then you see here I get a warning that in my persons I have get derived state from props. And in there I'm indeed returning a new state here. But since I have an uninitialized state, it's not recommended using that lifecycle hook basically. And therefore, you typically would want to get rid of that. I will do that to get rid of that warning. It's not an error, but it again doesn't make sense to have it here if we don't do anything with that state and we don't even have an initial state. But it did execute. That is something you could see. And then we had our rendering cycles here for the different components. Now, what about component did update though? Where's that? Well, it's nowhere to be seen because right now we weren't in the update cycle of our persons component. Get derived state from props only ran because it's also part of the creation lifecycle. The update lifecycle of persons.js will run as soon as I, for example, type something here, because then we'll actually trigger, if you have a look at your input in person component, will trigger this onChanged handler, which triggers this props changed. This props changed in person.js here is forwarded to the changed prop of the persons component, which is forwarded to our app.js file. And in there, if we have a look, changed calls the name changed handler, and this updates our persons, which we pass back in as a property to the persons component. And therefore, in this component, now the updating lifecycle will begin, because we forwarded that event from a child to the parent component, to the app component. There we updated its state, and then we got new data as a prop into this persons component. And therefore, this persons component lifecycle hook triggers as soon as we types. So let's type something, and let me clear the console before I do that. And you see now, get derived state from props runs, then render, then should component update, then rendering, also for the free persons, then get snapshot before update, where I get a warning that I need to return a snapshot value or null. And we should actually do that. So let's simply return null here. Let it reload. Clear that and type one character again. Now we have no warning. And then we have component did update. Now, in case you're wondering about that snapshot is a data package, so to say, which you then receive in component did update, so that you can save some state right before the update, like the scroll position I mentioned, and then you can use it to update the DOM again or update the scrolling of the user, let's say, in component did update once the DOM has been re-rendered. And to demonstrate this here, I'll just return an object with a message of snapshot. Of course, in reality, you would probably, again, return something like some coordinates for the scrolling. And then in component did update, you actually get the previous props, the previous state, so before the update, in case you need that for anything. And the last argument is that snapshot. And if I now console log that snapshot here, you should see that we log a message with, or an object with that message of snapshot. So let's toggle the persons, type one character, and indeed here we have that output from component did mount. So that is how you can use that snapshot to save some data before the update and then use it after the update. And that is the general component updating flow. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are some lifecycle hooks which we had in the past which aren't really supported anymore and which you should not use if possible. That was component will mount. Now for updating, we have two other hooks. There, first of all, we have component will receive props. And there you will actually get the props you are getting for this update. So here we can console log persons.js component will receive props and also the props. And if we do that and we try updating, then you actually see I get that same warning we had before with component will receive props. So this setup will not even let me use that. In older apps that would have worked. And yeah, it is removed because it was kind of a niche thing. You could have used that for updating some internal state, but it was easy to use this incorrectly and therefore you shouldn't use it anymore. And the other hook, which will also be removed or which is already not supported by some workflows is component will update. In the past, you had component will update here, and that ran right before component did update. And again, it was kind of hard to justify using this hook. It was often used incorrectly, and therefore this is now also removed. But if you're seeing this in older projects, it was a hook that existed historically, that technically still could be used, but that shouldn't be used anymore because you never really needed it. If you needed it, you were probably using React incorrectly, and that is why it's not available anymore.